However, what the government may claim, despite what the government may claim, the facts speak for themselves. According to Castellum AI, the total Russia sanctions placed by the country since 2014 is as follows: US 1,200, Canada 900, Switzerland 800, the EU 766, UK just 271. This isn't leadership, is it? Why is the government so slow?
Foreign Secretary.
We have led on cutting Russia off from SWIFT. We've led on closing our airspace and closing our ports. And if we look at the total financial impact, because the aim here is to debilitate the Russian economy, the sanctions that we have put on banks, defence, aviation and oligarchs add up to $364 billion. For the US, they add up to $340 billion. And for the EU, they add up to $124 billion. So we have to look at the overall financial impact, and it is much higher for the UK than for our allies. But of course, we encourage them all to do more. We need to work together.
Will the Foreign Secretary speak to her colleague, the Home Secretary, about the cruel and chaotic way that desperate Ukrainian refugees are being treated by her department? It cannot be right that there is no visa application centre in Calais. And Ukrainian refugees who travel thousands of miles to Calais are being redirected to either Paris or Brussels. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that this brings the UK into disrepute?
The Home Office have placed staff in Poland and Hungary to help people. They've also, the Home Secretary has announced a new pop-up application site in Lille. And I can tell the Honourable Lady that the Home Office has set up a surgery for MPs in Portcullis House, which I'm sure she would be very welcome to take any cases she has too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this International Women's Day, does the Foreign Secretary agree that a way to amplify the message that we're sending through sanctions to Russia would be to call on every woman in Russia, the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, the aunts, the friends of those in the Russian army who are attacking a neighbouring state and causing such misery and suffering, for them to send out a message to those soldiers to stop it and to return home?
Well, my honourable friend is right that, of course, as well as the huge humanitarian crisis this is for the people of Ukraine, it is also seeing the deaths of many Russian soldiers, many of whom have been sent to Ukraine under false pretenses. The claim that the Ukrainian people wanted liberation, that simply isn't true. And as we warned in advance of this invasion, President Putin has sent thousands of Russian young men and women to their deaths. And that message is being received in Russia.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks into this awful war, Ukraine has suffered terribly, but it stands defiant. Putin is isolated, his economy is in freefall, and his actions condemned around the world. We're united in our desire to ratchet up pressure on Putin. But the UK has sanctioned just 8 of the Navalny 35 list of oligarchs. The EU has sanctioned 19 and the US has sanctioned 15. We welcome the government's U-turn on sanctions legislation yesterday that should help us catch up. But sanctions against oligarchs only work if we know where wealth is hidden. Will the government commit to urgently reform Companies House to leave Putin-linked crooks with nowhere to hide?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, first of all, the honourable gentleman needs to look at the overall size of the sanctions that we've put on. 364 billion of assets have been targeted by the UK, 340 billion by the US, and 124 billion by the EU. And we have led the way, whether it was on SWIFT, whether it was on freezing bank assets, whether it's on closing ports. And as for the point that the honourable gentleman makes about the 2018 Sanctions Act, it was the Labour Party who wanted changes to make it tougher for us to sanction oligarchs. His friend, the chair of the Labour Party, said in the third reading of the bill that the bill gave ministers excessive power which could not be justified for the need for speed. She even called for additional bureaucracy through a cross-Whitehall committee. The U-turn is on his side.
David Lammy.
Mr. Speaker, the world watched Putin's premeditated stalking of Ukraine. We saw the lies, the false diplomacy and the manufactured grievances, and then we witnessed the destructive invasion of a sovereign state. Mr. Speaker, this was a crime of aggression. The creation of a special tribunal will help the global community hold Vladimir Putin and his cronies personally responsible for this war, and it would complement the ICC's investigation. Ukraine's foreign minister backs it, several of our allies and partners back it, leading lawyers back it. Will the Foreign Secretary now do the same?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with the honourable gentleman that we are seeing horrific crimes taking place in Ukraine, which are the responsibility of President Putin. That is why the United Kingdom have worked with our allies to put a case to the ICC. There were 38 states, which is the biggest ever group referral to the ICC. I think that is the right route to tackle the war crimes which we consider could have taken place or are taking place in Ukraine. And what we want to do is work with countries to collect the evidence. My right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will be travelling to The Hague to work on that specific issue.
Carper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the strong package of sanctions imposed by the government. But if President Putin is to understand that we're serious, then he also needs to know that we're going to be able to sustain that package of sanctions over a considerable period of time. And he's only going to believe that if we're honest with the public that it isn't just going to be a cost to Russia, but it's also going to have a significant economic cost here, and that we have to make the argument that it's necessary to pay it to keep us safe and secure in the future. And I urge the Foreign Secretary to do so.
Well, of course, there will be an economic cost for British people from these sanctions in terms of their energy bills and their cost of living. But that cost is nothing compared to the cost to the people of Ukraine of this horrific barbarism they're facing. And it is also not compared to the cost of allowing Putin to succeed. Because what we know is if Putin does not lose in Ukraine, then this will not be the limit of his ambitions. He has already been clear that he wants to see a greater Russia that could encompass countries like Moldova and the Baltic states. So it's vitally important that we throw everything at sanctions. We help as much as we can with defensive weaponry into Ukraine, because this is a battle that Putin needs to lose.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The SNP has supported the government's efforts on Ukraine. We took some criticism for that, I have to say, but I think it was the right thing to do. But I have to say in that spirit, there is mounting frustration on these benches at the lack of progress and the lack of ambition in the UK's sanctions regime. The rhetoric is simply not matched by the reality. The reality is that the EU has gone further and faster on these sanctions matters. Can I urge the Foreign Secretary to work more closely with the EU, particularly in the due diligence on individual sanctions, and replicate the EU's sanctions in order to actually complement the EU's efforts and have a much more comprehensive sanctions regime, rather than sending them a nice letter with no month's notice to sort their financial affairs?
Foreign Secretary.
What the honourable gentleman says simply isn't the case. What we are seeking to do here is debilitate the Russian economy. We have targeted and sanctioned 364 billion of assets. The EU have targeted 124 billion of assets. Yes, there are specific issues over individuals, which we are addressing through the emergency legislation that went through the House and will be in place next week. And we will be able to sanction all the individuals that he is referring to. But it is simply not true to say that the UK has not led on this. We have led on it. We led on SWIFT. We led on banning ships from British ports, which I know the honourable gentleman was arguing for last week. We led on closing airspace to Russian planes. And it simply isn't true what he is saying.
Ms. Ross. Foreign Secretary.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 5, 10, 18 and 19 together. The United Kingdom has been at the forefront of diplomatic, economic, humanitarian and defensive support to Ukraine. The UK was the first European country to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, and my honourable friend, the Right Honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, is convening a group of countries to do more of that. We're the largest bilateral donor of aid, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including our largest ever aid match contribution to the DEC appeal, which has now raised over £100 million.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Russian forces are doing to Ukraine what they supported the Assad regime to do in Syria. Starve, bomb and target civilians, schools and hospitals. In Syria, with the support and funding of the UK government, the White Helmets provided vital search and rescue services and other crucial support. This saved thousands of lives and helped to document the atrocities. Will the Foreign Secretary commit to supporting a similar organisation in Ukraine to save lives there?
Foreign Secretary.
What is happening in Ukraine is simply abhorrent. Our current priority is supporting Ukraine through humanitarian aid. We're donating £220 million of humanitarian aid, which is the leading figure in the world, and that will be used to save lives and protect vulnerable people. But I will listen to my honourable friend's suggestion and see what we can do on that front, because we need to do all we can to address this horrendous humanitarian crisis.
Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know my honourable friend is as proud as I am that the sanctions we've put on Russia to try and support Ukraine are the most powerful we've ever done in history. But does she agree that we may need to go further and there should be nothing off the table in terms of who or what we're targeting? We need to do whatever it takes to cripple the Putin regime.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right. Nothing is off the table, and we have been working and are working with G7 partners. We want to see them go further in areas like a complete ban on SWIFT, in a complete freezing of all bank assets, and committing to a timetable for reducing dependency on oil and gas, because fundamentally Russia is a state propped up by the oil and gas industry, and in order to really tackle the funding for Putin's war machine, we need to cut off that funding stream.
Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Russia's invasion began, we have seen horrific violence from President Putin against an independent, sovereign nation. And I know this government will continue to support Ukraine against this barbarism and help her to return to safety. Can my right honourable friend confirm that whilst this violence is ongoing, we will do all we can to ensure we offer humanitarian support in the best interests of the Ukrainian people, and detail how communities like North Devon can best assist?
We have deployed our humanitarian teams to neighbouring countries, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Moldova. They're working very closely with local agencies. We've put in a record sum into our DEC appeal, which is also generating massive donations from the British public. It's very important that rather than donating goods, the public are encouraged to donate cash to the DEC appeal or other trusted charities and aid organisations. What the Polish government have said is that donations in kind generate disproportionate amounts of additional work and cost, which prove ineffective and counterproductive to the needs of those affected. So can I strongly encourage people to donate financially to the DEC appeal? That is the best way to get funding through to the brave aid workers on the front line.
Caroline Anson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I attended a rally on Saturday in my hometown of Eastbourne, where people demonstrated their solidarity with Ukraine and, as she says, donated to the DEC appeal. But that same morning, we saw a series of televised images of very sick children having to be evacuated from the sanctuary and specialist care of their hospital setting under bombardment. Can I ask my right honourable friend what medical support we are providing to Ukraine and to neighbouring countries so these little lambs have a chance?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the United Kingdom is the #1 donor of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, £220 million. We're also doing more than any other country on medical support. The 6th flight of medical supplies went out to Ukraine last night. And I can assure my honourable friend that Foreign Office teams and MOD teams are actively supporting getting very ill children out of Ukraine so they can get the medical support that they need.
There'll be more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the actions this government has taken in response to the distressing humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And of course, across Keighley and Ilkley, we are all deeply concerned about these deteriorating events. So can my right honourable friend confirm that the substantial funding that the government has put in place will deliver the vital support to aid agencies as they respond to this distressing, deteriorating situation?
Secretary.
Well, we can all see how terrible the situation is with 2 million people fleeing Ukraine. We are providing humanitarian assistance, as I've outlined. We're providing Ukrainians with access to basic necessities and vital medical supplies as people are forced to flee from their homes. And we will continue to work with our friends and allies across Europe to deliver as much as we can to those in need.
Catherine McKinnell.
The Foreign Secretary knows that a vital way to help Ukraine is to stop those who've stolen money from the Russian people hiding it in our capital city. But after years of austerity, our hollowed-out enforcement agencies simply do not have the resources to go toe-to-toe with billionaire oligarchs. The world's other major financial centres, New York, doesn't have the same problem, and it takes a much more robust and well-resourced approach to tackling illicit finances. So will she acknowledge that without proper funding of our law agencies that can tackle illicit funding, we can have all the tough laws in the world, but people will still see the UK as a soft touch?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we've established a cross-government task force to enforce the laws we're putting in place on oligarchs. I think it's important to note that the legislation that we passed yesterday will actually reduce the amount of bureaucracy required to sanction oligarchs. So it's going to help target our resources better across the government so we can focus more of our efforts on enforcement. And the honourable gentleman asked me earlier about further measures on transparency. Those are all being introduced and we are very committed to that.
Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, I was speaking to friends of mine, Ukrainian friends who live in Kendal, just a day or two ago. They have family in Kiev and family in Crimea. In Kiev, they know exactly, tragically, what is going on. In Crimea, they are completely in the dark and fed only what Putin tells them. Would she agree with me that one of the ways we can help Crimea, how we can help Crimea and the whole of Ukraine, is to ensure that people within Russia and Russian-controlled territories know the truth of the murderous barbarity being done in their name? Will she be encouraged, I'm sure she is, by the fact that in the last week the BBC's Russian language website has seen a trebling of its number of visits? But that's only 10 million people, and there's 150 million in Russia. What can she tell us to help us to make sure information is got to the Russian people?
Tim, sorry, don't take advantage, please, Foreign Secretary.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right about the importance of the BBC in communicating to the Russian people and the fact that they have been lied to for years through disinformation, biased state TV, and we are now seeing Putin taking even more repressive measures to stop social media. One of the factors of this crisis is that young people in Russia are less likely to believe the regime because they did have access to social media. Putin is now trying to cut that off. We are working with social media companies about what we can do. We've established a cross-government information unit to communicate with the Russian people directly in Russian language. And the other point I would make is one of the impact of sanctions and one of the reasons that we've targeted banks is it sends a message to the Russian people when they are forced to queue for money or when they can't get on the tube or when they can't access the normal services they've been accessed. And I welcome the actions of corporates in Britain to withdraw their services from Russia because the message has to get across to the Russian people that this appalling war is being fought in their name.
Ben.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, on the referral to the International Criminal Court, what more can be done to assist in the collection and preservation of evidence, including forensic evidence, of potential war crimes? And I ask the question because if that evidence is held in towns which, heaven forbid, the Russians eventually take, by the time the International Criminal Court asks for it, it may no longer exist.
Exactly. In terms of our ICC referral to the prosecutor, which is now being taken forward. We are working closely with our allies on helping collect that evidence, and it's important we did that early on. This is being led by the Justice Secretary. As I've said, he'll be visiting The Hague to work out how we can do and make sure we've got that evidence collection. And can I praise the brave British journalists who are currently operating in Ukraine? We saw a terrible attack on the Sky team, completely unforgivable action by the Russian army, and those people are valuable in helping collect the horrendous evidence that is happening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ukraine's national debt is already crippling their economy. In 2020, it stood at $94 billion. At this truly dark moment, it's unconscionable that it should be required to service that debt or take on more. So can she tell us whether she's had any conversations with other governments, the IMF, the World Bank, G7 or EU foreign ministers, about sweeping debt cancellation for Ukraine, perhaps along the lines of the mutual aid agreement struck by the Allies in World War II?
The Honourable Lady makes a very good point. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has been discussing this with G7 finance ministers. We are doing all we can to support Ukraine and enabling them to have the finances they need, both to resist Russian aggression, but also eventually to be able to rebuild their country after this horrendous invasion.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the member from Array who began this question that, like all bullies, Vladimir Putin demonstrates horrific patterns of behaviour. He helped to starve Syrians in Aleppo and elsewhere, and now he is obliterating Ukrainian cities. But don't we also have to look at our own patterns of behaviour? Because, Mr. Speaker, I see the same administrative failures that hampered our response to Syrian refugees, now limiting that desire that the British public have to help Ukrainian refugees. That administrative incompetence is harming our approach. And can I ask the Foreign Secretary what considerations she has made of the inadequacies of the Home Office on Foreign Office objectives?
We do have to learn the lessons of the past 15 and 20 years where we didn't do enough to tackle Putin, we didn't do enough to tackle Russia, and we allowed the build-up of force, and we didn't respond strongly enough to what happened in Crimea and what happened in the Donbass. And I'm determined to do things differently. That is why the UK is leading on diplomacy, but also on the toughest possible sanctions and on the toughest possible support for the Ukrainian people in their resistance. I've already briefed the House on the Home Secretary's rollout of new centres to help Ukrainian people with the visas. She's opened up a family route, she's opened up a sponsored humanitarian route, and we continue to take that forward, and we are open for refugees.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And today being International Women's Day, we see all the women trying to escape with their families, with their children, with their mothers and fathers, to reach a place like Poland, which of course has offered refuge to some million refugees, Ireland, several 100,000, but here in the UK, barely 100 being able to find refuge. And this is a shameful lack of humanity in the face of the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in Europe since World War II. Does the Secretary of State agree that this paltry effort to offer refuge is a stain on our otherwise commendable effort to the crisis in Ukraine? And will she urgently work with the Home Secretary, shake up the Home Office and get this sorted?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, as I've said, the Home Office have opened new centres for people to be able to put their applications in. They are running a 24/7 helpline. They do have the surgery for MPs in Portcullis House. And I would also point the Honourable Lady to the fact that we are the largest donor of humanitarian aid, 220 million. We want to help people also settle in region. Many people coming from Ukraine want to settle locally, and we're also helping in that effort by sending our humanitarian teams to the region.
SNP spokesperson Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On International Women's Day, Europe is leading and united in welcoming over 2 million refugees, almost all of which are women and children, fleeing the bloody and murderous war by Putin against Ukraine, its citizens. Yet, pitifully, the UK stands at only 300 visas. Shamefully this morning, Mr Speaker, we learned in the Daily Telegraph that while Ireland has waived visas and expects to welcome 100,000 refugees, the UK government has expressed fears that this will create a drug route to the UK. So on the very day that President Zelensky will address this House, does the Foreign Secretary realise that the Home Office's continued xenophobic and inhumane immigration policy must be for her and her office a complete humiliation, as it undermines the support for Ukraine and its people? And will she now call on her colleague, the Home Secretary, either to reverse this policy or to resign?
Foreign Secretary.
As I've said, we've opened up 2 new routes. The Home Secretary has opened up a family route. She's opened up a sponsored humanitarian route. And we're also doing huge support in the region. We're working very closely with the Ukrainian government as well as local governments like the Polish.
Mr. West.
Question 4, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 4, 14, 17 and 23 together. Russia's assault on Ukraine is unprovoked, premeditated, barbaric and an assault on a sovereign democracy. And the UK has committed £220 million of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and the region. We are in regular contact with our allies across the world, as well as international agencies such as the UN and other humanitarian partners and donors, to assess the needs on the ground and to ensure an internationally coordinated response. We call upon Russia to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law.
Liz Twist.
Mr Speaker, it's absolutely vital that those humanitarian corridors remain open to facilitate the safe passage of refugees from Ukraine, as well as the safe passage of humanitarian aid into the country. So what steps has the Minister taken in conjunction with NATO allies to ensure that that happens?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we note Russia's claim of creating humanitarian corridors. These are just not credible. The current humanitarian corridors that Russia have highlighted lead into Russia, and it is an obscene and offensive gesture to the Ukrainian people to invite them to take refuge in the arms of the country currently seeking to destroy theirs. It is not credible, and we call upon Russia to allow proper, meaningful humanitarian access.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. A constituent trying to help her elderly and disabled relatives out of Ukraine described their arduous 19-hour journey from the south to leave for biometric enrolment due to the lack of safe routes in the south. They are now awaiting an appointment in Poland, but who knows how long that will take. They need to know, like others have asked today, what more the Foreign Office will do with the Home Office to make this process quicker and more effective.
Mr Speaker, as my right honourable friend said, the Home Office has established a forward presence, including just over the Ukrainian border into Poland, in order to facilitate cases like the one that she has just raised. We continue working closely with the Home Office to ensure that their work on receiving Ukrainian refugees is quick and as effective and as efficient as possible.
Bel Ribeiro Addy. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mariupol has been described as a living hell by those who've been subject to the vicious bombardment in the city. Can the Minister say what the government is doing to get people who are under siege, including brave Halo staff, rescued into some safety?
Mr Speaker, the honourable and gallant gentleman raises an incredibly important point. Our ability to project project influence into Ukraine is understandably heavily curtailed. We will continue working to ensure that potential abuses, human rights abuses, are catalogued and put forward for subsequent trials in the ICC and other places if relevant. And I take the point about what more can be done to help the brave people who have stayed behind to do great work in Ukraine, what we can do to help them evacuate the country. I can't give him details at the moment, but his point is well made.
Caroline Downage.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has spoken about the work ongoing with the Home Office to process applications of refugees coming over the border into Poland, but we also know people are flooding over the borders into Romania, into Hungary, into other neighbouring Moldova, other neighbouring countries. What more can we do on the ground in those countries to help swiftly get people to our shores?
Minister.
The honourable lady, my honourable friend, raises a very important point. The Home Office have established a forward presence, as we said, in Poland, but also in the other countries bordering Ukraine to facilitate the forward passage for those wishing to come to the UK. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary have made it clear we intend to have a generous offer to the Ukrainian people, a refuge to those seeking that, and we will continue coordinating with the Home Office in their work to establish routes to the UK.
John Burrell.
Partly for humanitarian reasons, there are siren voices suggesting that we should commit to a no-fly zone in Ukraine, notwithstanding our existing support to the country, notwithstanding our commitment to Article 5 and to NATO. Will he assure the House once again that there is no intention to intervene directly, militarily, in this war for a host of reasons, including the fact it would lead to a wider conflict?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the UK should be rightly proud of the support that we gave to the Ukrainian armed forces over a number of years through Operation Orbital, through the early deployment of NLAWs, those anti-tank missile systems which have proven so effective, and we will continue to provide support to the Ukrainians in their self-defence. The Secretary-General of NATO has made it very, very clear that it would be wrong for for NATO to engage directly in conflict with Russia, which is the inevitable byproduct of a no-fly zone. Putin is desperately trying to paint this as Western aggression against Russia. We must not do anything which will allow him to perpetrate that perverse distortion of reality.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But could I ask my right honourable friend, if, God forbid, Russian forces start to deliberately attack nuclear facilities near the western borders, what is my right honourable friend having conversations about contingency plans which would need to lead to a mass movement of the refugees already in that area? And would he agree with me that that pretty much constitutes an attack on NATO allies?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we take very seriously the attacks or the threat of attacks against nuclear facility. Nuclear safeguarding remains a priority for this government. I won't be drawn on the conditions of what might be defined as an attack on NATO, but nevertheless, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO is a defensive organisation. It has never expanded by force or coercion. Our support to the Ukrainians is steadfast, but there is a clear dividing line between an attack on one of our good friends, that is Ukraine, and an attack on a NATO member state.
Minister Pleatgill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This International Women's Day, hundreds of thousands of women are massed in the freezing cold at the borders of Ukraine, traumatised children in their arms as they flee from Putin's bloody, unprovoked war. Families have been separated, thousands of homes destroyed, whole cities cut off from water, food, healthcare and other basic services. This is an evolving humanitarian situation, and the pace and scale of displacement is unlike anything we've seen in Europe for a generation. 2 million refugees have already fled the country, and millions more may cross the border in the coming days and weeks. So can the Minister please tell us today how much of the 220 million announced actually for humanitarian aid is within Ukraine, and that for those that have fled the borders? And will he agree to provide us with a monthly breakdown of pledges against what has actually been dispersed? We've got to act swiftly, and we do need to know what has been dispersed to date. So will he tell us?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes the point this is a rapidly evolving situation. We have made recent announcements of humanitarian support, which are very significant, the largest in the world at this stage. We will, of course, be more than happy to keep the House up to date with the dispersal of that humanitarian aid, and we will do that through the normal means.
Gareth Davis.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
India is the world's 6th largest economy and an important partner for the UK. In May last year, the UK and India committed to strengthening our economic and security relationship through a new comprehensive strategic partnership. Our trade and investment with India is set to grow further, and we continue to work together on security and defence.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree that the UK's development finance organisation, British International Investment, has a critical role to play in strengthening our economic ties with India and promoting our entrepreneurial spirit that our two countries share?
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree of the importance of British international investment across the world. And can I point to the very firm statement that the Foreign Secretary gave at the Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, when she emphasised the need to strengthen our economic and defence relationship with India in order to pull them away from the orbit of authoritarian regimes such as Russia.
Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister could, with India now arbitrarily detaining UK nationals such as my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal for over 4 years now and failing to defend the democratic right of national self-determination for Ukraine, how the trade negotiations are going.
Mr. Speaker, can I point again to the very important statement that the Foreign Secretary gave yesterday? It is vital that we continue to strengthen our economic and defence relationship from India. However, I would like to point that the constituency case that he mentioned regarding Jagtar Singh Johal was raised by the Foreign Secretary with her counterparts in India recently.
Andrew Jones.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK is working closely with our G7 partners to make it clear our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that we will not accept Russia's campaign to subvert its democratic neighbours. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, is working extensively with her G7 counterparts and met with them in Brussels on the 4th of March to coordinate our response, including robust economic measures, financial sanctions in response to Russian aggression.
Jones.
And I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. Does he agree with me that the situation in Ukraine matters not just for European security, it matters for the whole world, and therefore we need a global response? Our global allies must join us in taking a tough stance on sanctions and strong support for the people of Ukraine. The attack on a democratic nation may have taken place on our continent, but it has significant global implications.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, discussed our potential sanctions response with G7 partners in Liverpool late last year, and he is absolutely right. The eyes of the world are watching our response to this, and the message we must send is absolutely clear, that the G7 and the wider international community, including countries in the Far East, many, many miles from this conflict, are resolute in standing up against this kind of aggressive behaviour, and we will maintain that position.
Minister Stimgoiter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Minister said about coordination with the G7 on Ukraine, but would he also agree with me that Putin seeks to create instability and insecurity elsewhere in Europe at the same time, including in the Western Balkans, in Moldova and, of course, in the Caucasus? Could he tell us what he's been doing with G7 counterparts and indeed our partners in the EU to address those attempts to create instability across the rest of Europe?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, met with the Prime Ministers and representatives of the Western Balkans just last week. He is absolutely right that we mustn't allow the situation in Ukraine to have a destabilising effect on other parts of the continent, or indeed, as my honourable friend said, other parts of the world. We will continue our close engagement with partners in the region and beyond to ensure that we deal with the situation in Ukraine and do not allow it to have a destabilising effect more broadly.
Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the free world has woken up to the reality of the cold-hearted ruthlessness of Putin's police state, does the Minister agree with me that the most important thing that members of the G7, who are also members of NATO, can do to secure European security is to raise their defence budgets to levels that we used to spend when faced with this sort of confrontational approach from Russia?
Minister.
My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. The UK is, I think, rightly proud of the fact that we have consistently met our 2% of GDP target for NATO expenditure. We warmly welcome the recent commitment of the German government in what is, I think, a politically bold and incredibly important move to increase their defence spending. This situation in Ukraine is a reminder that peace comes at a price, and we have to be willing to pay that price to maintain peace.
Now go to topicals. Barbara Keeley.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's actions have shattered European security. In response, we've been at the forefront of providing support for Ukraine, stepping up sanctions to debilitate the Russian economy that funds Putin's war machine, isolating Russia on the world stage and strengthening NATO's eastern flank. We cannot have a world where might is right and sovereignty and territorial integrity are trampled. I'm rallying our partners to boost support for Ukraine and strengthen our collective defence.
Barbara Keeley.
Mr. Speaker, there have been reports of several actions by Russian forces in Ukraine which violate the laws of armed conflict, including reports today of the shelling of a hospital in Mariupol. Can I join my honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, in underlining how important it is to document these incidents so that those responsible can eventually be held to account for their actions? But also, will the government do all it can to ensure the creation of a special tribunal to investigate the crime of aggression? Because the Ukrainian people deserve justice.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I agree with the Honourable Lady about the appalling atrocities that are taking place and the need to document those atrocities. That's why the UK, with partners, 38 states, put the referral to the ICC, and that's why we're working very hard with our partners to collect that important evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Putin's Russia has been making aggressive statements towards Sweden and Finland. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK should be very supportive of their application to NATO should they decide to apply, and we should look to expedite that, again, should they decide to apply?
Mr. Speaker, NATO has a strong partnership with Sweden and Finland. Our close coordination, I can assure her, will continue. Our relationship with Sweden and Finland extends to our value partnership in security and defence, bilaterally and through regional groups such as the Joint Expeditionary Force and the Northern Group. I note closely what she said about future applications to join NATO from these states.
Shadow Minister Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Vladimir Putin's decision to severely restrict the BBC World Service in Russia is, I'm sure we'll agree, an attack on freedom of speech and accurate, trustworthy, excellent journalism. The BBC has provided reliable information to the Russian people as Putin wages an illegal and unprovoked war, which he claims to do in their name. Will the Minister therefore tell us what steps he is taking to ensure that the BBC World Service isn't targeted further in both Russia and across the rest of the world?
Mr. Speaker, this government is firm in its defence of media freedom. This conflict in Ukraine has reminded us, if indeed we need reminding, how important the job of independent, honest journalism is internationally. The BBC World Service is a jewel in the British crown, and that the Russian language output that they are providing is incredibly important, allowing Russians to understand what is being done perversely in their name.
Rob Butler.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates the dangers of autocratic regimes all too vividly. So can my right honourable friend assure the House that the UK actively supports the right of people to determine their own future wherever they are in the world, not least in Taiwan?
Foreign Secretary.
The world, including China, are watching how we and our partners respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine. The reality is the only thing that Putin and Xi understand is strength. That's why it's so important that we bring more countries into the positive orbit of democratic, free enterprise, freedom-loving economies, and that is what we are working to do with our partners in the G7 and more broadly.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, it's reported today that the UK government regards Ukrainian refugees entering Ireland as a security threat. Women and bairns fleeing Putin's bombs, a security threat. When is this government going to cut the hyperbole, cut the bureaucracy and get these poor souls sanctuary in this country?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has made it absolutely clear that we will open our arms to Ukrainian refugees. The Home Office is working. The Home Office is working to ensure that that is done promptly, and of course we will continue to support the Home Office in the work that they do in this area.
Putin has shown that he's prepared to attack nuclear power plants and has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the importance of maintaining the UK's strategic deterrent as a NATO asset is all the more vital in these dangerous times?
Well, my honourable friend is right about the reckless actions of President Putin and the destabilisation and the attempted destabilisation of nuclear facilities. And the United Kingdom called this out at the UN Security Council. President Putin is trying to distract from his appalling invasion of Ukraine and the fact that it is not according to plan by resorting to increased rhetoric. And we simply shouldn't respond to these threats.
Jessica Morton.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Financial Times reported today that UK taxpayers may be forced to foot a £43 million bill for loans taken out by Russia's biggest coal company and underwritten by the government's export agency. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary if she knows who the International Secretary was at the time that the deal was agreed with one of Russia's richest oligarchs, and whether the minister in question personally authorised the agreement?
Who wants it? Foreign Secretary.
Well, I know from my time at Trade that those agreements tend to be signed off by officials.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in the session, ministers mentioned humanitarian corridors. What is being done to ensure humanitarian corridors are safe, secure and appropriate? And what is the UK government doing to uphold international humanitarian laws?
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. As I said in response to an earlier answer, this farcical claim by Russia that they are opening humanitarian corridors eastwards is, of course, a nonsense. Those Ukrainians fleeing the invasion from Russia are typically doing so westwards into those countries bordering Ukraine. My right honourable friends made the point that in support of those people, the best thing that the British people can do wherever in the UK they are is to make cash donations rather than donations in kind. We will ensure that that humanitarian support reaches the people that it needs to, and we will continue supporting both at the borders and here in the UK those Ukrainian refugees as they flee conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite our deep and bespoke ties with Israel and with the Arab world, the UK was entirely absent from the process that led to the Abraham Accords in the summer of 2020, and last year's integrated review made no mention of them whatsoever. Does the Minister agree that if the rhetoric of global Britain is to mean anything, surely the UK should be central to encouraging more of our partners across the Arab world to normalise relations with Israel for the good of the whole Middle East?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has made clear her commitment to the Abraham Accords at the Gulf Cooperation Council UK Foreign Ministers meeting on the 20th of December. The UK warmly welcomes the historic steps taken to agree normalisation agreements between Israel, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco and Sudan, and we will continue to work with the US and regional partners to actively encourage further dialogue between Israel and other countries in the region to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Dr. Jamie Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that in order to deter foreign states from sponsoring or launching cyber attacks on the United Kingdom, that now is the time, especially considering recent Russian aggression, to show the world that Britain is willing and able to retaliate?
Foreign Secretary.
The UK remains vigilant to cyber threats, and we're ready to defend against them, working closely with our allies to deter, mitigate and attribute malicious cyber activity. And we have been very active in calling out the terrible cyber activity by the Russian government. And of course, we will consider all levers of power to protect the UK's security.
Sarah Champion.
Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the former Foreign Secretary commissioned an equalities impact assessment into the government's aid cuts. We have been trying for almost that length of time to get the document into the public domain. Today is International Women's Day.
Will the Foreign Secretary publish the report by 4 p.m. today?
Well, the Honourable Lady knows that in the budget we are doing this year, we are restoring the aid budget for women and girls back to its previous levels, and we're also restoring the humanitarian aid budget. But it is a matter of policy that we don't publicly release equality impact assessments because it has a chilling effect and people can't be honest internally. That is why we don't release them. But of course, I'm very happy to discuss the issue with her further.
Committee, Tom Tugendar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my right honourable friend for bringing us on to International Women's Day. Today is obviously an important day for celebrating the actions of so many courageous women around the world. Will she perhaps speak, however, to those who have been made particular victims today, those who've been chased out of their homes, those young women who've been sold into trafficking, not supported as refugees, those women who are even now being brutalised in North Africa as they're being forced over the border as slaves into southern Europe? Will she please speak to the action that her department is taking to defend those women and girls?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely good point about how many women and girls are suffering, and COVID has made that situation worse. That is why we are restoring our humanitarian budget. It's why we're restoring the women and girls budget, and it's why we are working on our prevention of sexual violence initiative to stop that happening, as well as increasing the amount of development spending we are using to tackle human trafficking, working with the Home Office. And we are working on our international development budget. We will be announcing it fairly shortly, along with our overall humanitarian strategy.
Aisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the importance of the international events that the House is dealing with this morning is a clear demonstration that the Department is not the right place for the protocol to ultimately be dealt with. But on that vein, can I ask the Secretary of State that she recognises, that the Secretary of State recognises the huge damage being done by the protocol? It's costing £100,000 per hour to businesses in Northern Ireland. It's damaged the sovereignty of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. It's costing haulage 27% increase in prices. Will the Secretary of State now set a deadline, an absolute deadline, to deal with this matter once and for all?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman I am dealing with this matter. I met various European countries last week to discuss reforming the Northern Ireland Protocol, which simply isn't working. What we have is communities in Northern Ireland being treated unfairly. We have an issue of getting goods from GB into Northern Ireland. We put forward a concrete proposal that will also protect the EU single market, and we need to see movement from the EU.
Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour of representing one of the largest Chagos Highland communities anywhere in the world, and the vast majority of them were absolutely appalled at the Mauritian government's recent publicity stunt, planting a flag on the outer islands of that archipelago. Can I get a reassurance from my right honourable friend that we support UK sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and let me be absolutely clear that the UK is in no doubt about its sovereignty over Biot. We were disappointed Mauritius turned a scientific survey into a political stunt. The raising of Mauritian flags on outer islands of Biot was an unhelpful way to approach a bilateral dispute. We did remove the flags planted by Mauritius on Biot territory. There certainly seems to be a range of reactions from Chagossians to this event, and it's also very interesting to hear of my honourable friend's constituents, and I'd like to pay tribute for all of his work representing Chagossians living in Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is cautioning against donations in kind to Ukraine because of the red tape our exports are tied up in as a result of the Brexit deal. I know that for a fact because I've explored it on behalf of a number of charities in my constituency. So can I ask the Minister this? What action will the Department take to talk to EU counterparts to ensure the flow of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, given the complexity of sending second-hand goods, etc., abroad now?
What the Honourable Lady has said is simply not true. The Polish government, who I think the Honourable Lady should be listening to, and she should take responsibility here, have said that donations in kind generate disproportionate amounts of additional work and cost, which prove ineffective and counterproductive. I think, with all due respect to her, the Polish government know more about the situation on the border with Ukraine than she does.
Angel Mills.
What discussions are the government having with our overseas territories and Crown dependencies to ensure that the measures we're taking on illicit finance are being supported by them, i.e. those same rules are being introduced in their own territories as well?
Good question. I thank my honourable friend for his question. The UK and the overseas territories stand united in condemning the Russian government. The UK sanction regimes apply to all of the overseas territories who are in complete step with the UK and our international allies are implementing sanctions against Russia.
Tony Lloyd, Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that the National Crime Agency is underpowered, but we know that we have a common interest with our European allies in the search for credible information about those oligarchs who should be sanctioned. So can ministers tell us what steps are being taken to internationalise this search process to make sure we do sanction those who should be sanctioned?
We are working with our international partners. I attended a meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council along with the US and Canada. We are talking about enforcement. We're sharing lists. We're sharing information to make sure that our crime agencies are able to tackle this illicit activity.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary said that one of the things that pained her the most was the sale of embassy buildings over many years, and she hoped no more of it would happen on her watch. Will she cancel the proposed sale of 45% of our Tokyo embassy estate, which would deeply dishearten one of our closest allies at a time when we are seeking to strengthen the Western alliance?
I share my honourable friend's deep attachment to our Tokyo facilities, and I'm working very hard with our officials on what we can do to make sure that we retain our terrific presence, which is just over the road from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and any help that my honourable friend would like to give me as chairman of the APP Japan is very welcome, including financial assistance and help with the Treasury.
Mr. Speaker, what representation has the Minister made to your counterpart in Kazakhstan on the use of force by security forces on people protesting against living standards, and B, the repression of peaceful protest? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, following the outbreak of violence in Kazakhstan, my noble friend, the Lord Ahmed, met senior representative of the Kazakh government, including President Tokayev's special representative. In these contacts, he underlined the need to ensure that law enforcement responses are proportionate and in accordance with Kazakhstan's international obligations. He also stressed the importance of the investigation into the unrest being conducted urgently, transparently and effectively.
Maurice Robertson,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the world rightly focuses on the terrible events in Ukraine, can I remind the House of the terrible ongoing conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where women in particular are suffering the most terrible attacks. There's also a potential famine situation. I know the Minister is taking a deep interest in this, but perhaps you could tell us if there's any more that the government can do to help.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for continuing to shine a light on the terrible situation in Ethiopia. It is the world's most severe humanitarian crisis. From north to south, 30 million people require life-saving aid, 5 million displaced people because of conflict, tens of millions of people affected by the drought. In the north of the country, I urge again for all parties to lay down their arms and facilitate the humanitarian access. One truck has got through since December, and they need 100 a day. There's a high-scale risk of loss of life, and we must continue to stand with the people of Ethiopia, and especially, as he says, the women and girls on this International Women's Day.
Good. Is it relevant to these questions?
It is indeed, Mr.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you. Following the Foreign Secretary's answer earlier to me about the FCDO's Equalities Impact Assessment conducted in March 2021, I'm seeking your advice, Mr Speaker, on any other way to encourage her to fulfil her duty to this House, as the Ministerial Code states, to be held to account for policies, decisions and actions, to be as open as possible with Parliament and to refuse to provide information only when disclosure would not be in the public interest. The Foreign Secretary has said the government's practice is not to formally publish equalities assessments and adds her view that this would have a chilling effect on the advice prepared by officials. But this is confusing, Mr Speaker, as a range of equality impact assessments have been published in the past. For example, the coronavirus bill. And no one will be surprised that the former DFID's commissioning of independent reviews of its assessment work in the past, as well as ICAI, is also examining such issues. Fundamentally, it is deplorable that the Foreign Secretary used the fact of this assessment to celebrate her department, but will not put the information into the public domain.
Are we ready for an answer? I think it will be helpful. It's very important that scrutiny committees have access to relevant papers and records to do the job the House has delegated to them. The International Development Committee is best placed to assess what information is needed for its inquiries, and I trust that the Government bench has heard the honourable members' concerns and will respond to the committee's request in a timely manner and provide the papers. Right, let us go to the UQ. We come to the UQ. We call on Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr Speaker, thank you for granting me this urgent question to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on how her department can speed up the urgent refugee applications coming from those leaving Ukraine.
Okay. Minister.
Mr Speaker, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a barbaric and unprovoked attack, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people. He must fail in Ukraine. This government has brought forward a generous humanitarian offer to those Ukrainians who want to come to the UK to escape this conflict. Last week, the Home Secretary announced a new Ukraine family scheme for those with family ties to the UK, and we are extending this scheme further to include aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins and in-laws. The scheme went live last Friday and has already seen over 10,000 applications submitted, of which over 500 visas have been issued, with more being issued as we speak. We've also announced we are setting up a new humanitarian sponsorship visa, and we're working at pace with our colleagues in the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities to set this up, alongside who will also be working with the devolved administrations. We have made significant progress in a short space of time on top of the first phase of the package my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, set out to this House last week. I would also remind the House a crucial part of the application process is providing biometrics, so we can be sure applications are who they say they are. Sadly, we are already seeing people presenting at Calais with false documents claiming to be Ukrainian. With incidents like Salisbury still in our minds, the governments will not take chances with the security of this country and our people. Our friends in the United States, Canada and Australia are rightly taking the same approach as we are. I would like to update the House, though, on the measures we are taking to speed up and process the applications and ensure we can help applicants as quickly as possible. We have surged staff to key visa application centres across Europe, particularly in Poland, and moved more biometric kit to support them. We've ensured casework teams are standing by in the UK to process applications to ensure no delays. We will also be establishing a larger presence in northern France to help Ukrainians in the region. It is essential we do not create a choke point at places like Calais, where there are dangerous people smugglers present, but also to ensure the smooth flow of people through the system from across Europe. Alongside this, we are working with our embassies around the world to ensure we use our diplomatic channels to support our efforts and to provide the latest information. Mr Speaker, we have taken decisive action, and we are now providing regular public updates on our caseworking numbers, and will continue to keep the House updated on this progress.
Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
May I thank my honourable friend for that comprehensive answer. Mr Speaker, it is very impressive that the Prime Minister and this government have taken such a world-leading role in uniting the West, uniting the West, imposing one of the toughest sanction regimes and providing military support for Ukraine. However, the UK has always been generous in admitting refugees, especially in times of crisis in Europe, dating back to the Huguenots. Concerned constituents have contacted me, so could my honourable friend please tell the House how we can speed up the necessary processing of refugees, leaving this truly awful situation in Ukraine? Could he also update the House on what is happening in Calais, so that they can be processed either there or close by providing transport? I understand we require a process to securely check applications that are made, not only for security reasons, but also so that we can provide the support in this country. But however, we surely could speed the process up by, for example, rewashing biometric and other data that we already have. We need efficiency, but also humanity when processing applications of refugees from Ukraine, and we should warmly welcome those refugees to this country.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the way he put his questions, and he is right. You know, we have stood forward as a country to support Ukraine, not least in supplying it with the very weaponry that's being used to defend people's homes and to push back this barbaric and unprovoked attack on their nation. I appreciate the concerns that there are. I can say today, you know, we are training new caseworkers who, as of tomorrow, will be taking more decisions. We are looking to review what we can to use some of the technology we have around, for example, what we deployed for the British nationals overseas route and how that could be brought in to effect as well. Also reviewing some of the requirements biometrics around under-18s as well to, again, free up points in these appointments in visa application centres. And also in terms of specific points around northern France, we are looking to establish a presence in Lille and also potentially to look at transport as well, options from Calais to Lille. There are issues with providing a particular application points at the port, but we are looking at how we can do it, and we expect that to be set up within the next 24 hours.
We come to Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is deeply disappointing that the Home Secretary isn't here to respond, given the gravity of this issue, especially after she gave wrong information to the House several times yesterday. 2 million refugees have left Ukraine. Other countries are supporting hundreds of thousands of people. The Home Office is currently issuing just around 250 family scheme visas a day. Most people want to stay close to home, but some want to come here to join family or friends, and we should be helping them. Instead, most people are still being held up by Home Office bureaucracy or being turned away. Yesterday, the Home Secretary told the House twice that a visa centre en route to Calais has now been set up, but it still doesn't exist. The Foreign Secretary just said it might be in Lille, over nearly 75 miles from Calais. The Home Office said this morning that no decision had been taken. Well, which is it? Has it? Where is it? Can people get there yet? The Home Secretary said yesterday it's wrong to say we're just turning people back, but there are 600 people in Calais right now who've been turned back and are being told to go to Brussels, where the visa centre only is open 3 days a week, or Paris, where people are still being told the next appointment is the 15th of March, a week away. In Warsaw, people are also still being told the next appointment is the 15th of March, a week away. And in Rzeszów, the booking system seems to have completely broken down. This morning, they're sending people away. The Home Office was warned by the Chief Inspector in November that the geographical spread of centres, of visa application centres, was a real problem for vulnerable applicants leading to difficult journeys. Yet they did nothing about it, even when they were given weeks of warning by British intelligence that an invasion was coming. Yesterday, the Home Secretary also told me elderly aunts were covered by the scheme. 2 hours later, the Home Office helpline said no, they were not. I welcome the inclusion of those extended relatives relatives, but the government should not be continuing to change this in a chaotic way rather than opening the system properly. So will the government urgently set up emergency visa centres at all major travel points, do the security checks on the spot and then issue emergency visas for Ukrainians, all family but not just family, so they can come here and the UK can do our historic bit to help refugees fleeing war in Europe, as we've done before?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the points on setting up a facility in northern France, the answer was in the comments I've just made, in terms of Lille and in terms of setting it up in the next 24 hours. In terms of the numbers she quotes, as I touched on, we are training more decision makers as we speak. We are pulling people in from across UKVI to ensure that there is literally an almost frictional approach to caseworking in this, and we will see the number of visas issued each day ramp up each day as we go forward. But, you know, this is a complex scenario. We have seen, as I've touched on already in the statement, people present themselves at Calais port pretending to be Ukrainian. Now, I appreciate some opposite may think that's not an issue, but I think we only need to look at some of the statements coming out the Kremlin to see which countries are very much in the crosshairs of Mr. Putin's Russia and regime, and also only have to look back a short period ago to see the impacts on this country, in this country, of attacks by those pretending they'd come here to look at a cathedral spire. So we will move out to extend. We recognise the desperate plight there is. That's why we're working with countries on the ground, providing humanitarian aid, ensuring we are providing the support, helping to provide support as people cross the borders, looking to ensure that we have a wide system that allows people to come here, abandoning many of our normal requirements to come through. You know, we recognise it's not a time for the usual immigration process, hence the system that we are setting up. And as we said, we have a confidence it will expand, it will go through. We know the British people will be generous. We know when we move to open up the sponsorship visa that many, including many of our own constituents, will want to stand forward. And actually, I would just say, we look at the actual surveys being done in Ukraine about which countries they feel are most on the side, and it's notable which one regularly comes top.
Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that the Home Secretary is not here today to answer. In response to my question yesterday, the Home Secretary said, "I have already made it clear, in terms of the visa application centre that has now been set up en route to Calais, that we have staff in Calais." That was untrue. And under any normal administration, that in itself would be a resignation. There is no visa centre at Lille yet, in spite of the fact that the Foreign Secretary earlier this morning said that there was. A week ago, the Home Secretary announced a humanitarian sponsorship visa. There is yet no humanitarian sponsorship visa. Mr. Speaker, it's time the Home Office granted a visa waiver and allowed children and all of those adults with Ukrainian passports to come into the country now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the Home Secretary clarified her remarks yesterday, and I've been clear in the position on the centre we are establishing. So I do hear the appeal made. What we would say, though, you know, there is a reason why we believe it is right that key security checks are done before people arrive here in the United Kingdom. We are, though, reviewing what particular position is around providing biometrics by those aged under 18. Again, we will do that based on the balance of risk and advice we receive, including from our security services. As you know, we are a country that is in Mr. Putin's crosshairs. You know, we are a country that has stood resolutely behind the Ukrainian government and continue to do so, and will be a country that will welcome literally thousands of people here in probably one of the biggest moves to provide shelter and refuge for a generation.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Stuart C. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by joining with the right honourable gentleman? It is time to stop messing about with the broken bureaucracy. It's time to scrap it altogether. No more visas required. That is how we quickly fulfil our obligations to the people of Ukraine. Our European allies can do that safely and securely, so why can't the Home Secretary also? There are other ways to address our security concerns after arrival, as we do with non-visa nationals, as we did with evacuated Afghans. Don't quote Salisbury as that has absolutely nothing to do with this altogether, Mr. Speaker. How does he justify, in any event, all the other massive restrictions on who can come? Why can't a cousin join a cousin? Why don't any non-family ties count at all? And crucially, why is it that many thousands of Ukrainians in this country, whether skilled workers or agricultural workers or students, cannot be joined by anybody under the family rules just because they do not have permanent residence here? People can't wait months for possible community sponsorship. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask again, doesn't the last fortnight illustrate absolutely just how ill-conceived the disgraceful Nationality and Borders Bill is? Under that bill, a Ukrainian fleeing here to join a cousin or a friend could be criminalised, offshored, imprisoned, all because there is no visa for them. That is utterly indefensible, is it not?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, having been quite closely involved, along with colleagues in the Ministry of Defence and in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, in the evacuation from Kabul and Afghanistan, I would actually remind the honourable gentleman that actually we did do security checks on people who were leaving. Again, very different, very quite a dynamic environment, that one, particularly given the obvious threats. So the idea that we didn't do any checks before evacuating, the suggestion made in that question, is not correct. In terms of the launch of the sponsorship scheme, we do not see this taking months, as he's just suggested. We're already seeing people coming forward with generous offers of homes, jobs, and wider support. So I can think of my own constituency of a hotel that's already starting to look at offering jobs and accommodation, given they've got a Ukrainian speaker. And as he knows, last week I had a helpful and productive conversation with the relevant Scottish Government Minister. To be fair, I know they will step up and absolutely do what they can do as well. I would say, he says it's not appropriate to use the Salisbury example, but again, we do have to remember why we have these checks in place. And it is because, as we've already seen at Calais, there are people presenting with false documents, there are people making claims that are not true, and those are matters we have to be. But I take on board very much that the House wants to see that we get on and process, that we get more people put to this work, and that we make sure that we can, as quickly as possible, provide for a very large number of people to move into the UK. As I've already touched on, one of the biggest provisions of sanctuary we would have done in a generation.
Can I just say to everyone, to all each other, this is going to go to about 1:40, so the more we have shorter questions and answers, the better it will be. Caroline Noakes.
Snails also move at pace. There is no date set yet for a humanitarian sponsorship visa, and as a result, those people coming forward with generous offers are advising their Ukrainian friends to apply for visitors' visas. But what of those who do not have passports? What of those children who are completely undocumented? When my honourable friend the Minister says he is moving at pace, it needs to be a great deal faster.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of with children and others, it is possible for travel to be done here to the UK without a passport if they're with permission having been granted. As a former immigration minister, the right honourable member will be familiar with that process. But in terms of where we are, as we say, we are making sure that this process is being stepped up. We've extended the provisions, and of course, as the sponsor route comes in, that will provide a whole new opportunity for people to extend a generous offer and a hand of friendship to those who need sanctuary in the UK.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, for the granting of this urgent question today, but I do think a statement by the Home Office would have been a much better way forward in order to deal with the confusion of recent days. I think we're united in this House in wanting to do the right thing for the Ukrainian people fleeing in fear of their lives and offer protection and sanctuary. And that's why the Home Affairs Select Committee has invited the Minister twice to come and explain how the Home Office is dealing with that. Now, the Minister has agreed to come next week, and we are very grateful for that, but we shouldn't have to ask twice.
Now, I want to ask the Minister about why the Home Secretary on Sunday went on the record with journalists and said, "I am investigating the legal options to create a humanitarian route. This means anyone without ties to the UK fleeing the conflict in Ukraine will have a right to come to this country." On Monday, government ministers seem to have no idea about this. So can the Minister update us? Is this under consideration by the Home Office, as it's quite clear there is a lot of support for a humanitarian visa to be granted?
Well, in terms of the invites to the Home Affairs Committee, as you'll know from my original letter to her, we made the point that to pull away officials to do a session tomorrow would have actually meant us pulling them away, and including myself, from the preparation to actually bring people into the UK. But we specifically said we would look to agree a later date, something that perhaps could have been reflected in the statement issued on Friday. But moving on to her more substantive points, as we say, we've got the process in place as it stands for those who have relatives. We are extending that to quite well beyond the normal relatives and dependents that we look at, and the wider sponsorship route will give many other opportunities for people to come to the UK.
Peter Byrne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that most help in processing visas should be done close to the Ukrainian border? And what is the government doing to increase processing there? And in particular in the small country of Moldova, which has taken over 80,000, do we have a presence there? And how open is it, that visa centre?
Well, thank the honourable member for his points. We do have visa application centres in the countries bordering Ukraine. We've certainly stepped up capacity there, particularly in the EEA, because normally EEA nationals, it's a very low number of people who actually need to go to a visa application centre. So we've been stepping up and bringing in resource from other areas to bolster them. There is a visa application centre in Moldova. My understanding is it's moved to 7-day working to increase, although of course we accept obviously the demand will be very high and strong, and people can apply from any visa application centre they can get an appointment at. They don't need to be at one of the ones immediately in a country on the border. As I say, we continue to expand the capacity, and we are looking at the position in relation to those under 18 and whether they need to provide biometrics.
Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, I think the House would be more impressed with the Minister's security concerns had his initial response not been to tweet, "Let them pick fruit." Mr. Speaker, he speaks about complex scenarios. Is he not even a little bit embarrassed that the United Kingdom, uniquely in Europe, seems to be finding it so difficult to tackle these complex scenarios?
Well, again, I would make the point that we've stepped up a system that will grant 3 years of leave, giving people more permanent status here in the UK and a security that they can move forward. And as we've always said, there's a range of routes available, and our focus is going to be making sure we come through. But I would make the point that it should come as no surprise that those countries that are least popular with the Putin regime, ourselves, the United States, Canada, Australia, are taking similar approaches.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's fantastic the breadth of support that the UK government is offering to Ukraine, as recognised by Ukrainians. I also think it's shocking to hear the opposition jeering at the prospect of the government trying to protect UK people from further such attacks as took place in Salisbury. Nevertheless, I do agree with colleagues who have a concern about the speed of processing of these visas. And in particular, in my own constituency, I have somebody whose sister-in-law is stuck in Ukraine and somebody else whose aunt is stuck in Ukraine. Can my honourable friend give us an update on what exactly we're doing to facilitate this kind of family reunification?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for her points in question. I'd make the point that people don't need to wait in Ukraine if they're thinking of applying to the humanitarian family visa, if they are able to safely travel across Ukraine. I think we all recognise the reality of the barbaric approach that some Russian forces are taking to civilians. It's clear that there are regular breaches of international law and going on, and war crimes being committed. So again, there is a real issue about whether people can genuinely travel safely across Ukraine. But if they do wish to, they can travel to a safe and democratic country on its border, and from there make their application. And as we've said, we have extended the definition and are expanding rapidly the case working team to ensure that we can get through the applications and get people here with their relatives here in the UK.
Does the Minister understand how poorly it reflects on this country that our system for processing Ukrainian refugees is so slow and so shambolic, even accepting the need for biometric tests and so on? Why can't they be done on the spot? And these desperate people who want to come and join family here in the UK, why can't it all be expedited?
Well, again, I think across the world people are reflecting on the immense support that the United Kingdom and its government has provided to the people of Ukraine, as reflected quite regularly by comments from those who are in Ukraine. But in terms of the process, we are looking to speed up, but it is important that we carry out essential security checks for the reasons we've outlined.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hate to harp on about this phrase, at pace, but can my honourable friend the Minister give some indication whether it will be weeks or months before the humanitarian sponsorship route is open? And separately, I take his point about security and the need for biometric checks. I don't understand why those biometric checks can't be done in this country when we have got people safe and sound.
Thank you. First, I'd say that those who are applying to this are actually in safe countries as we speak. There's no requirement for people, as I've just touched on in a previous answer, to stay in Ukraine to make an application. In fact, there's no need at all if they can safely make their way across the border to one of the safe and democratic countries next door that we are supporting to provide support to those who are crossing the border. There are, I think he would know from his own experience, a range of reasons if we bring people into the country to perform checks, such as, certainly we don't want to go down paths of things like using immigration detention powers or things like that while certain checks are undertaken, which we do not believe would be appropriate at all.
FLIVE effort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One visa centre in Poland has closed its doors. It's no longer allowing walk-in appointments. It's 81 degrees outside. There's an 81-year-old woman outside and women and children. There's plenty of room inside, but they won't open the doors. This is complete chaos and unacceptable. What's the Minister going to do about it?
Well, happy to look at the particular example cited, but we are surging staff and resource. We're conscious of the position there about how we can increase capacity, ensure we can get as many people in as possible. In particular, I've already touched on looking at the position around whether children do actually need to give biometrics, given the position there. Again, that will be guided by some security advice we receive, and that will then mean that, of course, there will innately be large numbers of extra points and plus a cohort that will not need to submit biometrics.
Mr. Speaker, one way in which we can rapidly scale up capacity is to use technology, Mr. Speaker. What is my honourable friend's view about the accessibility for Ukrainians with biometric passports to use the UK Immigration ID Check app, which of course does apply and has been used by many applicants from Hong Kong? Can I commend that course of action to him? Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that point. We are looking at the AUK2 app. I would say that to adapt it to HK SAR passports as well as to BNO passports, BNO was relatively simple, HK SAR was slightly more complex. It is something we've been looking at. It is something, though, that brings certain challenges, but making sure that if we open it up, passports can be read and that the process goes through appropriately. But it is something we are actively looking at and considering, because, again, that allows us then to issue things like an e-visa as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, from offers by individual constituents to the action by Welsh Government in talking to Cardiff Airport about welcoming refugees there, we see support from the British people very keen to welcome Ukrainian refugees and immensely embarrassed that whilst other countries across Europe are welcoming them with open arms for 3 years without any questions about being part of a particular family, why is the Minister so determined that we are not able to have a broader welcoming system for all Ukrainians to come here?
Well, I would point to the sponsorship system that will be set up, which will be open pretty much to many and all Ukrainians, although I would again remind the House the vast majority of people, understandably, want to remain in the region. They want to go home after the invader has been defeated and expelled from their country. So there is that balance. I think the idea that all Ukrainians are looking to move elsewhere is not a correct one, but it is the sponsorship scheme will allow a wide and generous offer, and of course we very much look forward to seeing offers to sponsor people coming forward from across Wales.
Julian.
It's about training new decision makers. How many new decision makers are being trained today? What discussions have taken place with retired decision makers and caseworkers, and what discussions have happened across government with other people used to taking decisions on behalf of Her Majesty's government on how they could assist with this issue?
Thank the right honourable member for his thoughtful question. We have got 50 in training today. We are opening up bringing the whole of UKVI's quite significant resource to bear, because in our first instance would be to take decision makers off other immigration routes, i.e. people who are very familiar with immigration decisions, so that we can sort of, because they are more likely to be able to more quickly take an immigration decision in this area. We are also talking with other government departments about things like apprentices and others who could potentially backfill in other parts of the immigration system. And, UKVI does employ in the thousands of decision makers, and we are looking across the piece at who we can deploy into this area, has experience, and then potentially backfill other parts with those perhaps one of the government departments.
I have a list here of everything my constituent has done to get his Ukrainian wife into this country. He started with an application on the 12th of February. They lost him in the system. They lost his family in the system. I've spoken to the Minister. I've been to the hub. Today, he emailed me 4 times to say that he was in Rzeszów. He was told that the TLS system was broken, their appointment hasn't been registered, and there's no guarantees they'll be seen. Final email says, we're asked to leave the VAC. They've only managed to process 7 people, and they are down from 2 clerks to 1. He's been advised to go to Warsaw, to the embassy. He needs biometrics because nobody will look at him until he has biometrics. He's a UK national. All he wants is to get his wife and daughters back to Wishaw. Help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member will realise it wouldn't be appropriate for me to get into details of the individual case on the floor of the House, but very happy to speak with her afterwards and see what we can do to resolve the situation.
Carper.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows, as a former Immigration Minister, I am very sympathetic to the need to do appropriate security checks. But I do have to say to the Minister, as someone who's gone out publicly to defend the government on this issue, we do need to grip the pace of this, and it will require ministers to take decisions to move things along quickly. So can I say to him, on the humanitarian sponsorship route, the Home Secretary announced it a week ago. I heard what my right honourable friend said about weeks or months. I was thinking more days. I would expect a minister, speaking on behalf of the government, to be at that dispatch box by Thursday to set it out. We've got to start working at the pace that these events require. So can I ask him to give that commitment for an update on Thursday for the humanitarian sponsorship scheme?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly the government will be happy to update members on what's happening on Thursday, whether that's through a dear colleague or another appropriate forum. But certainly our intention is not that this is certainly not going to take months, and certainly it's more in the weeks before we start welcoming people into the UK. But this will be one of the most, as I say, an unlimited offer that reflects the generosity of people wish to make. But I appreciate we now need to get on and get it launched.
Speaker, I have been here since the start of business, and it's not often that I feel ashamed listening to a range of ministers with their half-baked excuses for no action. This is a time the President of Ukraine will be speaking to us later. And this is when our hearts, our minds and our prayers are with the people of Ukraine. For God's sake, please, ministerial team, government, get your act together and open the doors to these poor people.
Well, we of course look forward to hearing the President later and reflecting on the inspiration that he's been giving his people in resisting the invasion, including, of course, resisting the invasion with the arms that we have supplied to allow them to do that. But certainly we are, as we've outlined already, we're surging in more decision makers, we're upping the capacity of the VAT, we're looking at the position of whether under 18s should continue submitting biometrics, which will innately not only speed them, but of course free up appointments for others, and are moving casework and resource from across UK BI to support getting through the applications that are there, and we will continue to take further actions to speed up the process. So I do very much hear what the House is saying.
Tracy Crouch.
May I just take the opportunity to say thank you to the officials in the Harvard Cullis House who are providing really helpful advice to constituents. And I just counsel or advise the Minister that the advice that we're being given is to get people to Ruzev in Poland to support them through their application for biometric testing. But word on the ground is that there are no biometric appointments in Ruzev until the end of next month. So can the Minister confirm that when constituents' families are being sent to these posts for biometric testing, that they are actually available?
Well, I'm concerned to hear the example given, and certainly we will continue to look to increase the biometric capacity. As I've touched on, we are actively looking at the position for under 18s, which will then remove the need to, and whether we can adapt, as I touched on in an earlier question, the technology we used for Hong Kong BNO nationals who don't actually need to go to a VAC at all as part of their application, which would innately, again, create further capacity for people to come through the system. But certainly happy to pick up the process, and again, we'll be continuing to look at how we can surge and increase the capacity at our application centres across the region, not just the particular one cited.
Lomé.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Vauxhall want to see the UK make clear that refugees are welcome. We need a clear and simple process in place for people seeking asylum, but vulnerable people need support before they get to the border. Urgent humanitarian problems, including food assistance, access to transportation, sanitation and hygiene facilities, mental health, bereavement support, emergency healthcare, including for people living with HIV. So will the Minister please ensure that the UK's asylum system begins with immediate aid for people needing to flee?
Thank the member for her question, and she makes some strong points. One of the reasons why we're working closely with the countries on the border is that given the end of direct travel, it's extremely unlikely people would make the UK in a day. Certainly those who've just crossed the border from Ukraine will need a range of support, including medical support. And I know colleagues in DHSC are also talking with the Polish health authorities because clearly their hospitals are beginning to become fairly full, and there'll be need to look across Western Europe for others to support and to take patients from those hospitals into potentially the UK again, just thing. But I would be clear that people who arrive enter into our asylum system. They will arrive with status and be able to get on with lives. They won't have to make a further application here.
It borders my constituency. I fully accept the need for security checks, particularly on adult males. But the fact remains that the Republic of Ireland, with which we share a common travel area, has a population of 5 million, but has committed to 100,000 refugees from Ukraine, has admitted already over 2,000. This country, population 67 million, has come nowhere even close to that. Why not?
Well, first, I'd say that if you look at what we're doing, first, we estimate about 100,000 people potentially eligible for the family route, and we have an unlimited position in relation to the sponsorship route, which could well see us exceed quite significantly the numbers offered by the Republic of Ireland. And we're now moving to get visas are going out there. As I touched on, nearly 500 have been granted as of 9:30 this morning. More are being granted as we speak. We are surging decision-making capabilities and upping the biometrics process, which will, I can say to colleagues, will quickly see the numbers arriving in the United Kingdom, on top of the numbers, obviously, we've already welcomed as we moved out UK nationals and their families earlier this year.
Ian Paisley, briefly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Michael Jeff Kamenko, has been contacted by his family who have fled from the Ukraine. They have no documents no papers. Roxana's at the border with a little 3-year-old child, nothing. What assistance can be given to give that family hope and to get them to Northern Ireland and let them re-establish some semblance of normality? Where is the Christian compassion that this nation was known for?
I thank the member for the example. We are conscious that people are leaving without a range of documents. For example, the normal sort of proofs you might have of family relationships. It would clearly be inappropriate to insist people try and go to get a marriage registry certificate or things like that if they fled from their homes. We do have provisions which will allow travel without passports and other documents, obviously once certain checks and nominations are done. And again, that's part of the process that's being established, because we are conscious that even where people have access to documents, it may not be the full documents they might normally bring with them. And we're also conscious that people will have left innately, potentially in a hurry, so may not have had time to thought to bring particular documents. So certainly not having a passport won't be a bar. We would need to use other processes, though, to identify them, and that's not something that's unusual in situations where we're moving people at pace.
Steve Bryan.
Speaker, so much about this doesn't feel right, and my constituents know what they see. All of this is far too robotic, and to pick up the point made on the other side, there's very little Christian compassion being shown at the moment. Surely we are past the UK saying we're going to have a generous scheme. It's time to deliver a generous scheme. The family scheme is too slow. The humanitarian sponsorship scheme, which I raised in the Commons yesterday with the Secretary of State, is still in design over at the Department of Communities. And I do not want to hear the Minister say that's another department. He's the Minister at the box. At the very least, can we have a very simple online gateway up and running tomorrow where constituents who want to help can at least register their interest? There's so much compassion and want to help, and people are not able to do so.
Well, I recognise the honourable member's concerns. I must say, the vast majority of councils in this country took part in the Afghan resettlement scheme, including my own. And many are already offering to take registrations of details and offers of help as part of a process of preparing for the launch of the humanitarian sponsorship route. So certainly it's something that I'd encourage my own constituents to do, and I know he'll be encouraging his own to think of what offers that they can make. And as I say, the compassion of this country is shown by the fact that this will be an unlimited scheme on top of the family, and potentially could be one of the biggest movement into communities in the UK since evacuation in the 30s.
If not, we'll have to run.
I thank the Minister for his personal help, but can I also say that my constituents share the absolute frustration at the speed at which the government is moving on this issue. Can he get a grip on that situation in Warsaw? I've heard today, similarly, of families seeking to join their family in the UK who are being told there are not appointments available until at least the 15th, even though they've been in Poland for some time, having escaped Kiev. And will he tell us, will he publish how many staff have actually been posted now to our posts in Warsaw, Bucharest, Budapest, Bratislava, Chisinau? Have we actually sent staff? Are all of them operating at 7 days capacity? And how long do people have to wait for appointments in those locations?
Well, I thank the member for his points. Certainly we are surging staff to our visa application centres, as well as I'm conscious, obviously, FCDO have a separate system in terms of posts and diplomatic presence there. We are looking at how we can expand the capacities further, and also I've already touched on some of the things we're looking at to actually remove the need for a biometric appointment entirely.
Liz Roberts.
Yet again, we see the Home Office refusing to grasp the urgency of this crisis. Just like the Afghan resettlement scheme, these schemes are too limited and progress is too slow. My constituents are desperate to help. They're offering their homes, but no sponsorship information is available. Welsh Government is offering to help. Welsh local authorities are offering to help. What discussions has he had with them to facilitate this scheme, and what estimation does he have of the number of sponsorships available in Wales?
Well, in terms of engagement with the Welsh Government, I understand colleagues in the Government Department leaving it, having spoken with the Welsh Government and also the Scottish Government as well about the provisions. Of course, it'll depend how many sponsors come forward, how many people want to be part of welcoming people into their own homes and into their own community across Wales. I expect we will see a generous amount. But in terms of urgency and other things, I'd point out, we took 16,000 people out of Kabul in 2 weeks. We worked at pace. We're still evacuating people out of Afghanistan as we speak, and we'll soon be welcoming many thousands from the Ukraine into the United Kingdom, alongside the most generous sponsorship schemes that actually exist, given it is completely uncapped.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the Ukrainian refugees who eventually get here will be vulnerable women and children, and not all of them will have relatives here who can offer a roof over their heads. So has the government given any thought to setting up some sort of portal or clearinghouse where offers of accommodation can be made and basic safety checks can also be made before vulnerable people take up those offers?
Yeah, it's a very good point to be made that, this is potentially quite vulnerable individuals arriving in a cohort. We will need to make sure there are basic safeguarding checks, particularly if people are offering to welcome people into their own homes. I know my colleagues are closely looking at that and how it can be done, but without it becoming a barrier to enabling a swift movement of this scheme.
Mr.
Speaker, a refugee is a refugee regardless of the colour of their skin or their background. So I am deeply concerned about reports that there are refugees from a Burma background who have been stopped at the Ukrainian border and turned away. Does the Minister agree that these reports are despicable? And can they tell me what the government is doing to ensure the safe passage of all refugees fleeing from this horrific conflict?
Well, the honourable member's right to highlight that actually Ukraine provided safe haven for people leaving Afghanistan. It's not just one community living in Ukraine, that there are many people there who, it's a set of ideals, like our own country, it's a set of ideals as a nation. It is not based on a particular ethnicity. So no, certainly it would be concerning to hear if people are being turned away at the Ukrainian border. Obviously, we don't control the Ukrainian border. He will appreciate. And obviously, there is Ukrainian law in relation to men aged 18 to 60 who are required to stay in Ukraine in terms of military service, including dual nationals, which again is a decision taken by Ukraine. But certainly, we would be clear that race and ethnicity should not play any part in terms of the decisions taken at that border and allowing people to leave and enter into the safe and democratic countries next door, and then potentially move on to the UK via our schemes.
Mr. Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate that ministers and officials are grappling with a horrendously complex situation here, but it's worrying that some contradictory advice is being offered to members. I have a constituent who has pre-settled status, and I was told by the members' help desk on Thursday that she would be able to bring her 2 young children across. Yesterday she emailed to say no, the published advice was against that. I went back to the help desk who said they were going to escalate the query. I'm escalating it even further to you, Minister. Does this lady with pre-settled status have the ability to bring her 2 young children into the UK?
Thank you. I may wish to take away and look at under the EU, the rules around the EU settlement scheme, particularly if she was here with pre-settled status during the time of free movement, because there are some particular rules that apply to them that are actually, again, free of charge for application routes, by the way. So I'd certainly be happy to take that one away and get confirmation.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Minister may be interested to know, and indeed I'm very surprised he has not already mentioned, that Citizens UK have set up a registration link for communities and individuals who want to register their interest in community sponsorship. But community sponsorship is only a route by which people can come to the UK if a scheme exists to which communities can apply. The delay in setting up the Afghan scheme was, frankly, a disgrace. So can the Minister say when we'll have a scheme? And since community sponsorship is a lengthy process which can take up to a year before a community group can be matched with a family to come here, can he say what will be different about this scheme which will make it fit for purpose for the urgency of this crisis?
Yeah, I recognise a number of groups are encouraging people to register to help, welcome that, and again, once the official scheme moves forward, that will be a welcome source of information. In terms of community sponsorship, she rightly highlights some of the issue, and on a more wider point, it is actually something that we are going to look at, that we do think community sponsorship takes too long, there's too many barriers that can be thrown in the way of it. But in terms of this particular scheme, our intention is a minimised process. It doesn't involve things like local authority consent and some of the things that you'd expect to see in the community sponsorship. That is much more simplified of matching up. Someone's prepared to make a particular offer of accommodation and support, and then someone is able to take that up, subject to some should expect things like some of the safeguarding issues that I've touched on already.
Alan Cairns. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is wholly appropriate to recognise the breadth and scale of supports that the government have taken, but as well as the significant steps that the Minister and his colleagues have taken. But we also need to recognise and understand the desperate plight of people fleeing such persecution and the risks that they face. My constituent, Yuri Noble, has returned to Ukraine to bring family members back, but is struggling to get an appointment like so many others here. So in recognising the challenge the Minister faces, in recognising the challenge from the constituent, what consideration has he given to extending expired biometric assessments that can easily be extended to be made appropriate now?
As I touched on partly in my reference to the system being used for British nationals overseas, we are looking at what the role could be played in terms of previously submitted biometrics and those who've previously had visas to the UK in the recent past who possess a biometric passport. At this stage, as I say, we are conscious that where we can reduce the numbers who need to go to a visa application centre, this will free up capacity. As I say, our first thoughts, though, have been looking at the requirements for those under 18, and we're looking at the final security advice on doing that.
Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Using the risk from Kremlin operatives, who I suggest have rather more easy ways of reaching this country than posing as refugees, as an excuse for this mean-spirited and shambolic approach simply won't do. Until he follows the advice of the Right Honourable Gentleman, his friend for Thanet North, isn't it the case that he and fellow ministers are going to have to keep coming back to this House and explain this shambles, just do what he suggested and what the whole of the rest of Europe is doing, and offer visa-free entry for a limited period to Ukrainian refugees?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As I've already outlined, there's clear reasons why we're doing this. Where we do believe it's right, basic security checks are made before people arrive in the UK. And as touched on, this isn't just the UK. The USA, Canada and Australia are doing exactly the same.
James Gray.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, a professional couple from my constituency in Malmesbury tell me that they're currently in Poland trying to help their relations from Ukraine. They're very well educated and English speaking, of course. They tell me that they're sitting up late into the night, tussling with the complexities of the forms involved, including a form for one child who's 1 year old, and of course to whom the form doesn't actually apply, asks for his employment, and so on and so forth. They tell me that the information they're getting on the website is quite different to the information they're getting on the ground, that like so many others, they've been told they can't have an appointment for at least another week, that the hotels in Poland are full, and therefore they've got nowhere to stay, and they just need the thing simplified. I wouldn't go as far as asking for a visa waiver. The Minister wouldn't want to do that. But surely, to goodness, it could make the system simpler, simplify the form and cut the time taken to fill it up.
Yeah, it's fair points made, and certainly happy to hear the honourable gentleman's feedback in more depth afterwards and what his constituents have encountered. I say we have seen over 10,000 applications submitted for a scheme that went live on Friday, which does indicate quite a large number of people are getting through it. But certainly we're continuing to consider how we can make it simpler, quicker, and as already touched on, reviewing things like the need for those aged under 18 to submit biometrics.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm sure I don't have to remind the Minister on International Women's Day of the particular vulnerability of women in war zones. My Edinburgh South West constituent Oleg Dmitriev has 2 nieces in Ukraine. He tells me they're reluctant to flee because what they're hearing on the news makes them think it'll be very difficult for them to join their uncle in Scotland. And they're asking him why should they risk their lives to get to a third country when the likelihood of their getting a visa to join their uncle in the United Kingdom is vanishingly small. What should Oleg say to his nieces?
Well, we'd say to Oleg that first we've extended it to include nieces, and if they are his nieces and he wishes them to come to the United Kingdom, they'll be able to get a visa to do so. Obviously, as she touches on, travel from Ukraine, within Ukraine, people are in a perilous situation due to the barbaric actions of Russian forces. But certainly a niece would, as we've said, would stand a good chance of getting a visa, and certainly that they should make an application.
Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm proud of my constituents who are coming forward to offer as much help as possible. I'm proud of the Prime Minister in the way that he's leading the world, but the Home Office is cutting off their legs, and it is simply not good enough. Mr Deputy Speaker, does the Home Office recognise that this is a war of the likes that's not been seen for 80 years in Europe? We don't want to stand in this House and listen to plans and processes. We want dates, we want action, and the Home Office must react far more quickly than it's doing and get to the point of hubs of people, get them processed and get them in. This is a disgrace. When the Minister leaves this dispatch box, I ask him to go back to the Home Office and tell them to get a grip.
As I've outlined already, we're making quite a number of changes. We met officials this morning to push further ones through. We've extended the entitlements and who can apply. And as I say, this will become one of the biggest relocations of people since the wartime evacuation. Let's just get this into perspective and scale, beyond what we've done for BNOs, beyond what we've done over a number of years for Syrians, and what we propose to do for Afghan nationals. So this will show a generous side of the United Kingdom, alongside the support that we've been providing Ukraine more generally, and which has created a very strong impression of the United Kingdom.
I was speaking to a constituent yesterday, Stephanie, and she was fighting back the tears as she was telling me about how terrified she is about the security of her family that she has lost contact with. What I'm disgusted with is the lack of urgency from the government and compassion. Can the government say to me today why the visa application centre in Brussels is closed and why it is only open 3 days a week?
Well, as we say, we've been surging staff into the region. We know people, we don't want to see people having to travel all the way to Western Europe to make applications, having left the country, having made what can now be an increasingly dangerous journey across Ukraine, particularly if people come into contact with Russian forces who are showing minimal respect for international law, or perhaps none at all. And as we say, we are surging staff, we're increasing processing capacity, and members will start seeing the impact of that very shortly.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that the Home Secretary visited the Ukrainian Social Club in my constituency with the Ukrainian ambassador to hear directly from my residents. I have many Ukrainians in my constituency, and a number have relatives still in Ukraine where there are existing biometrics. Can I urge my honourable friend to look in further to the ideas proposed by my honourable friend from South Swindon and the Vale of Glamorgan to see if we can find electronic solutions?
Thank you for the question. I must say the Home Secretary had a very positive visit, and certainly the relationship we've had with the ambassadors and the community have been very strong, not given the broad range of support that we are providing to Ukraine, not just in the form of lethal aid into Ukraine itself, but around support including to countries on the borders of Ukraine who are now dealing with very large numbers, because of course, they keep saying this, the vast majority of people actually want to remain close to their homes because they want to go home once the invader has been defeated and driven from their country. But yes, we are looking further at how we can use some of the work we've done around things like the Hong Kong BNO route, the reuse of biometrics, and, as I've touched on a couple of times now, whether under 18s actually need to submit to biometrics at all.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I must say this government has some pretty strange priorities, which apparently thinks nothing of overturning national security advice when it comes to granting a life peerage to the son of an ex-KGB agent, but which is apparently putting obstacle after obstacle in front of refugees fleeing unspeakable violence in Ukraine. Will he listen to the voices on all sides of the House which are urging him to allow refugees to come here first and do the biometrics and the other security checks here? And does he understand that by simply saying they're already in safe countries is deeply insulting? They are traumatised, that their families are split up, they might not have finance. We need to be doing much more now.
Well, certainly the support provided, I wouldn't just dismiss the support being provided by Polish authorities, Hungarian, Romanian and Moldovan, and certainly they are doing an amazing job in terms of welcoming those who are coming straight over the border. We've touched on already on a number of occasions why we believe it's right that we do basic security checks before people travel to the United Kingdom, but many of our other normal requirements are being waived, and I don't think some of the solutions that would potentially be put forward around doing security checks here in the UK would necessarily reflect a warm-hearted approach.
Siobhan Bailey.
Mr Deputy Speaker, as it's International Women's Day, we're looking at experiences of women around the world, and I've been asked whether it's difficult being a pregnant MP. The answer is no, but I'll tell you what is difficult. Being a pregnant woman in Ukraine and children being in a basement where they're being attacked, and Stroud people want to understand what the chuff is going on, and I know the Minister cares. I know that the Home Office cares, and the picture is still confused and causing anxiety. So will my right honourable friend confirm that he will look at all biometric options to speed up, and particularly where there is information on websites and things saying people are going to get information back after 24 hours, that they do that, or they change the expectation and they deal with that properly?
I would agree. We're certainly keen to say, looking at the position around biometrics for under 18s, that would make quite a significant difference in terms particularly of family applications. There's some final security advice being considered on that, but we are very keen to move that forward shortly. We are looking at some of the electronic means, as I say, the B&O visa, for those who aren't familiar with it. If you have a HKSAR passport that's biometrically enabled, you can apply from home without a visit to a VAC. So we're looking at a range of options that could speed things up and remove the need to actually go to a visa application centre.
Sharon Mora.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Germans are waiting in Berlin Central Station to offer Ukrainian refugees their homes and their hearts. The people of Newcastle Central are no less generous, and yet their government greets war-traumatised families who have already crossed a continent with a demand that they go to Brussels or Paris for an unspecified amount of time, apparently because the Minister thinks they could be KGB agents. Will he say how long he expects Ukrainian refugees to wait in Brussels or Paris? And will he say what support he is offering financially and in terms of transport so that they can meet his ridiculous demands?
Well, I'd say ensuring the safety and security of our country is never a ridiculous demand. But in terms of the Senate, we've already touched on earlier in the question, we'll be opening up in Lille. Certainly, we've already touched on what we're considering around splicing up around children. And again, we will be having, we have an uncapped, unlimited system. And again, our position is very similar to what some of our core allies are also doing.
Mr Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Like many others, my inbox has been overwhelmed by generous offers of support for Ukrainian families. My constituents are ready and willing to offer help to those in desperate need. The only barrier to their support seems to be Home Office bureaucracy. Now is not the time, Minister, for box ticking and red tape. Now is the time to do everything we can. No more excuses. We have to move the process forward. We have to speed it up. Weeks, Minister, I'm sorry, weeks is simply not good enough. These are women and children. We have to speed it up. So can he assure me that those kind offers of help from my constituents and constituents right across this chamber are not going to be wasted?
They certainly won't be wasted, Mr Deputy Speaker. We're moving at pace to set up our systems, and we're moving at pace to increase the numbers so we can get it while doing the basic security checks which keep our people safe.
Tim Farron.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this may be Home Office incompetence, or it may be being done for political reasons. And if it is, can I tell the Minister that he has misread the country? Because like other people in this place, I have been overwhelmed with constituents offering their homes and space they've got to refugees from Ukraine. Local charity, New Beginnings, operating in Ukraine for many years, desperate to be a sponsor of people coming to the UK from Ukraine who do not have family links. When will that New Beginnings charity be able to sponsor Ukrainians to come here? They need to know that this week.
Well, certainly, I don't want to get into political point scoring on this particular issue. I don't think that's particularly seemly or appropriate. But in terms of the routes, we say we're working pace. Our first priority, of course, families and relatives, because we appreciate the vast majority of relatives will be able to stay with family, and we're working at pace in terms of setting up the humanitarian sponsorship visa, but obviously our colleagues in the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Community will be leading on operationalising the actual sponsorship element of that to ensure we can give the warm-hearted welcome that many want to give.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm so proud to represent a vibrant Ukrainian community in my Colne Valley constituency, and I'm equally proud to have so many people in my community opening their hearts and ready to open their homes for these Ukrainian refugees. We've done so much on sanctions, on humanitarian aid and on military aid. So why are we dragging our feet with all this bureaucracy? Will the Minister not only commit to put extra staff into these visa centres, but they need to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All the helplines need to be manned 24 hours a day. And can he assure me, by the weekend, thousands and thousands of more desperate Ukrainian refugees will be safe here in the UK with their family and friends?
Damn right.
I certainly hear the point. We're making, as I touched on, we're bringing in more specific decision makers. We're bringing people in from across UK VI who are experienced decision makers to ensure that once a decision's ready, a case file is ready for a decision, we can get on straight on and do it. We're certainly looking to expand where we can the visa application capacity, again, making sure we've got staff and others. We're looking at can we backfill that with staff from the United Kingdom as well. Again, this is more about staff availability necessarily in the actual physical structure. Certainly, we think sometimes local labour laws impact, but we don't think that will be an issue in this particular instance, given the urgency of the case. And crucially, as I've touched on a couple of times, actually, can we remove some cases from this process of needing an appointment entirely? So, for example, under 18s and potentially the use of the tech we use for the BNO, because a lot of BNO applicants never go anywhere near a VAC. They just use our ID with their passport. So again, that gives appointment capacity, but without actually any extra appointments.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Last week, I raised the case of my constituent and his wife, who were advised by the government helpline to go back from Poland to Lviv to collect her spousal visa. After my intervention, they were told to go to the VAC in Warsaw. An hour ago, they emailed me to say we're just out of the VAC centre in Warsaw, and again we've been told that they don't print visas and they can't help us. This time, according to the worker, their vignettes are printed in the UK and sent to the VACs. Unsurprisingly, the VAC didn't know how to help us. They didn't even have access to the Ukrainian database, which I find shocking that the Home Office couldn't arrange for 2 weeks now. Can the Minister advise when my constituent and his wife can come home safely to Glasgow?
Well, so no one should, certainly now, no one should be being advised to go anywhere near into Ukraine to get visas or any other purpose. Certainly, I'm very happy to pick up the case and see what has happened in that particular instance. In terms of certainly the VACs, you should be able to collect your visa from any VAC in terms of where we are. But I hear what's being said. I don't doubt what's being said, and I'll be happy to pick up on it.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I met with 4 of my Ukrainian constituents last week. They've been bowled over by the generosity shown by people of Ipswich, particularly the Polish community. There's actually a lorry approaching the Ukrainian border today, carrying £8,000 worth of gifts from the Polish community. 2 questions. I met with Alina, whose family are currently stuck in Kharkiv. Just a quick update on the possibility of a humanitarian corridor for her family to get out of Kharkiv, not to Belarus and Russia, but to a safe European country. And thirdly, Victoria said that if it is the case that some of the people who may be eligible for a family scheme don't want to take that option, could it be transferred to somebody else very close to them who might not strictly qualify via a family route?
Certainly, I think in terms of the situation on the ground in Kharkiv, I think we have to be very careful about how we take President Putin's offers of humanitarian corridors, not least given they are rarely respected and are often used, may well be used as a cover for breaches of international law that then follow. So I think we have to be quite careful about the concept of humanitarian corridors, and I've touched on already. Travel across Ukraine is extremely dangerous. We don't need to wait until you have any form of visa, if you can, to get into a neighbouring country and then seek to come to the United Kingdom. But certainly with the family route, people can either sponsor the family, or if they have space and available, this is when the wider sponsorship route will come in if there's someone they know and love in Ukraine who they would like to sponsor to be, or who has managed to get to a bordering country, a safe bordering country, who then they'd like to sponsor to come here.
Robert Keeley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I just want to give an example for a constituent who's trying to help his niece flee, who has fled from Ukraine, because it backs up all the things that he's hearing from his own side about how just completely unsustainable this system is. Last Friday they spent the whole day waiting for a form from the United Kingdom for a visa, and of course biometrics. They had to give a lot of complex information. After they'd given all this and the biometrics, they were then asked for bank details and for documentation which the niece who had fled from Ukraine just didn't have with her. It's now 3 days since that, and there's no sign of a decision promised within 48 hours. My constituent said, "I simply cannot put into words how angry and desperate we are becoming because of this shameful situation." What is the Minister actually doing to fix that chaos? Because that is a live situation, and that's actually what's happening.
Well, certainly I would be, I think in terms of issues like bank details and things that we might normally ask for in the immigration system, I can fully appreciate why that would be an unreasonable request entirely to someone who has escaped potentially whatever they could carry from their home in Ukraine, particularly as Russian forces advance. Very happy to look at it, certainly, if there's a need to ensure our decision makers are acting appropriately in terms of what they're asking for. Things like I wouldn't see it appropriate to be asking people for bank details from Ukraine at this time.
Order. We have to leave that there. We've done 8 minutes. One moment. We've done 8 minutes more than was allocated for the urgent question, and clearly with this crisis ongoing, there will be other opportunities for urgent questions and statements, and those who are raised in their chair with over 20 names, we will look to ensure that they get prioritised for the future. Point of order, Annalise Dodds.
Point of order, Mr Deputy Speaker. In the last 24 hours, the Foreign Secretary has twice accused me of seeking to slow down the UK government's ability to sanction individuals during the passage of the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. Once before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and again this morning during departmental questions. She made similar accusations against the Honourable Member for Rhondda before he corrected her, and she was compelled to apologise for having got the facts wrong, gallantly blaming her staff for the quality of her notes. Mr Deputy Speaker, the accusations the Foreign Secretary made against me do not stand up to scrutiny. I am using parliamentary language here, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm particularly aggrieved by the suggestion by the Foreign Secretary that I, in her words, wanted changes to make it tougher for us to sanction oligarchs. At no point during the passage of that Act did I seek to slow down the government's ability to sanction individuals who posed a threat to the UK. Quite the opposite. I was one of those who pushed for the inclusion of Magnitsky sanctions in the Act, sanctions against Russian oligarchs, which were actually then blocked by the Conservative government, who shut down the relevant committee debate after half an hour to prevent the issue being put to a vote. Now, I welcome Conservative ministers' belated conversion to the importance of such measures, but not the Foreign Secretary's attempt to rewrite history. The comments of mine to which she referred were explicitly about ministers using so-called Henry VIII powers to amend primary legislation without parliamentary oversight, not what she has intimated. Mr Deputy Speaker, given these points, would it be in order for the Foreign Secretary to come to the House at the earliest opportunity and correct the record?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving notice of a point of order. As the Speaker and the team from the Chair have said, that we're not responsible for the content of contributions made by ministers. However, the Honourable Member's point has been heard on the government benches, and if an error has been made in this instance, I hope the Foreign Secretary will seek to correct it as quickly as possible. Point of order. We'll take the further to the point of order before coming. Okay. Chris Bryant.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful. I was at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee yesterday when the Foreign Secretary made these allegations. She alleged that I had said things in the third reading debate on the 1st of May 2018 when I didn't take part in the debate on third reading in 2018. And in actual fact, I did speak on that day, and even if I say so myself, it was a particularly fine speech, which, well, nobody else is going to say it, so I might as well. But the serious point is here twofold. First of all, the Foreign Secretary came to the Select Committee determined to say these things and had clearly not checked the basic facts before she came to the meeting. Secondly, which would suggest a degree of deliberate recklessness about what she was going to say. Secondly, she then prayed in aid a document which she said she had in front of her, which was some notes from ministers, which had apparently from officials, which had apparently been incorrectly written out. Now, you will know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the convention in this House is that if a minister prays a document in aid, they have to provide it to the House. So can you ensure that the Foreign Secretary provides those notes? Because I'm concerned that somewhere in the Foreign Office there is a file on me which is full of lies and inaccuracies.
Thank the honourable member for his point of order. I've got no doubts whatsoever that the speech he gave was outstanding. But as far as his other comments are concerned, it's the same answer. The Treasury bench will have heard the comments that he has made, and I hope that if any errors have been made, that the Foreign Secretary will correct them as quickly as possible. Further to that point of order, Chrissy Matson.
Point of order. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was listening to the point of order from my honourable friend from Oxford East, who talked about the Foreign Secretary suggesting that she couldn't read her notes because her officials hadn't written them very clearly. Now, in topical questions, in answer to a question from my honourable friend from Newport East on who signed off a trade deal, she told the House that these deals she didn't know, and these deals are always signed off by officials. So can you tell me, Mr. Speaker, if following the Right Honourable Lady's comments today, whether the government has made any attempt to bring forward a statement to explain a change in the policy of ministerial responsibility, or if they haven't, have they made any suggestion that officials will now come to this House and answer questions and that ministers aren't responsible for them? Because it sounds to me like the Foreign Secretary is getting a bit of a track record here of blaming things on everybody else but herself.
I've been given no indication that any minister will be making a statement today. Should that change, the House will be informed in the usual way. Point of order, Michael Fabricant.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, you will be aware that the House of Commons has just published a report by the independent expert panel on the conduct of Mr. John Bercow. It says, in small part, 21 separate allegations were proved and have been upheld. The House may feel that his conduct brought the high office of Speaker into disrepute. This was behaviour which had no place in any workplace. Members of staff in this House should not be expected to have to tolerate it as a part of everyday life. And I concur. Now, there were many people in this House, I included, who tried to raise this on several occasions when John Bercow was Speaker, but nothing was done. And I feel that not only has John Bercow been shown to be of a disreputable nature, but in some ways this House has been put into disrepute. And I simply ask you, will there be any occasion for the Leader of the House to come here and make a statement about this damning report and the damning report about John Bercow, and also give an opportunity to debate how on earth this could have lasted so long, this terror of bullying?
Further to that point of order, Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Mr. Bercow has been shown in this report to be a serial bully, to have displayed undermining behaviour